Welcome back to Financial Clarity for Doctors, everyone. This is Rachelle Vanderzanden here with Corey Janoff.
Hello.
Yep. Thank you for joining us today. We're planning to talk a little bit about housing affordability or not affordability, basically. I think this is something that Corey and I have probably both talked to many of our clients about over the last couple of years. And it does seem like whether you're renting or buying, it's expensive in a lot of places, and costs keep going up when we're talking about housing. So we have talked a lot about, does it make sense to rent? Does it make sense to buy? But today we wanted to talk a little bit about like what made this happen? Like why is it so expensive? Is it going to change in the future? What should you do? All of those kinds of things. And a lot of people who are renting think, I want to buy a house someday. I think that's the case for most people, but the costs sometimes are prohibitive. They're very high, especially right now with rates being so high as well. So it's also, you own a home and it may not be your forever home. Maybe you're hoping to upgrade someday. Maybe you don't need to, but it would be nice to be able to do that. And you expect that on a high income that you earn, you should be able to do that. So I think there's this disconnect between we feel like we're doing well in terms of income, and yet we can't afford to own the home that we want to own. And that's a big problem that I think a lot of people are facing. So today we're going to do a little background on what is this, what happened, where's it going, what's going to happen in the future, all those kinds of things.
Yeah, housing, definitely one of the more common topics we discuss with people just because everyone needs a house or a place to live, I should say. And a lot of people want to upgrade one day or get a second home one day or move, whatever. It's definitely a common topic and a big component of the overall economy as well. But a little while back, I'm not sure this will probably be released late October, early November timeframe. But on August 30th, NPR has a Planet Money podcast that's really interesting. They're give or take 30-minute episodes, maybe a little shorter, and they just talk about all things money related, economy related, pretty interesting. But on August 30th, they had an episode on how to fix the housing shortage. I think that's actually what it was called, how to fix the housing shortage. And they profiled a Minneapolis man named Cody Fisher, who started a company named Footprint Development. And their focus is on environmentally friendly, low carbon urban housing developments. They try and keep things as carbon neutral as possible, low energy usage. When they demolish an existing building, rather than just take a wrecking ball to it and tearing it down, they literally take it apart piece by piece, set the metal over here, the electrical wires over there, the lumber over there, and they recycle pretty much the entire building. Um, which is, important because any developer has to complete environmental studies before they embark on any project. So, they're taking it a step further with that. But why is this, relevant? His mission is to create affordable housing that's environmentally friendly, kind of a future-minded asset. And Minneapolis is unique in that not too long ago, they did away with many of the zoning restrictions that developers face. And a notable change is allowing multifamily housing units to be constructed in areas that were previously zoned for single family housing only. And, these measures were voted on and passed by Minneapolis voters. And, listen to the episode to learn more. It's an interesting one. But one of the challenges that Cody faces in developing, he specializes in these apartment complexes. One of the challenges he faces is that not everybody, people seem to be all in favor of affordable housing. Yes, let's create affordable housing. If you ask anyone on the street, do we need to build more affordable housing? I would think, the majority of people would say yes, but they don't want it built in their neighborhood. The NIMBY, not in my backyard. It sounds good to have affordable housing, but nobody wants a 30-story apartment complex going in right next to their home. A lot of people would argue the key to affordable housing is to create more multifamily housing units. Think apartments and condos rather than single family homes. Build up, not out. You look at major cities around the world, that's how, they develop housing. It's, high rises, not single family homes that are spread out. And there's perks to that with greater housing density, helps create a more vibrant and diverse local economy, reduces commute times, it benefits local businesses, et cetera, et cetera. And we'll talk more about solutions later. But there's also a bit of a mentality shift required to go from, the American dream being everyone has their single family home with the white picket fence and a backyard to, having a more urbanized living in, more densely populated housing. But that would be one potential solution. So,
Yep.
anyways, why is housing becoming unaffordable for many, Rachelle?
Yeah. One thing I wanted to mention is that in Portland, there's actually a similar zoning change. There's like this residential infill project that was passed by the Portland City Council, which is really similar, where it allows multi-unit buildings to be built on lots that were previously a single family home. So when we have these older homes that need to be knocked down because they're just not maintainable anymore, like a construction or a builder can come in and put like 4 units on that lot. And again, I think you see that same sort of resistance to, just neighbors in those single family neighborhoods are like, oh, I wanted a house next door, not a condo unit. So, and I think that it will probably just become something that's more normal over time as more and more cities start to do this. So, hopefully, there's less of a resistance to it over time, too. But I do think it's important to kind of understand how a lot of this started. Like, why has housing become so unaffordable for so many people? And I think it really comes down to supply and demand. There's just not enough housing. Um, it's a lot of basic economics. If we have certain number of people that need housing and only a certain number of houses, then the cost is going to go up until we've priced people out of owning homes and even potentially just made renting too expensive for a lot of people. Um, Surprisingly, I was looking at a New York Times article, and a lot of this started back with the 2008 housing crisis. So when I think about that, I think lots of foreclosures, less expensive homes because banks had to resell these foreclosures and the like prices went down. So
That's
you
how I
think
bought my
about
first
that. Yeah,
home, the
me
foreclosed
too.
condo. There was like six
Yeah,
units available in the complex, and
yeah,
it was just haggle with the bank. Like, what are you willing? How low are you willing to go to offload this
right.
home? If you don't want to sell it to me, I'll just knock on the next door unit
Yeah,
and see
yeah.
what that bank's willing to sell it for.
So our first home was in 2010 and we bought from a builder. And it wasn't a foreclosure, but I think costs were incredibly low. And so this is like how this happens. So we have foreclosures, we have kind of a saturated market, and we have unoccupied homes that have fallen into disrepair because they weren't occupied. Like it was people, banks sometimes weren't able to turn around and sell these properties that had been foreclosed on. And then banks weren't lending as much. It was harder to get a mortgage, it was harder to buy. So builders didn't want to take the risk of building more homes and not being able to sell them or having to sell them at a very low price point and not recoup their costs. So builders built less after 2008. And it took a very long time for builders to kind of get back up to a more normal level of building. And that is a huge part of what created just this supply problem. It was just not enough new houses, not enough of these older homes that had been foreclosed on and were in disrepair, like having a new home built on that lot. Like that didn't happen for a long time. So there's the supply lapse. Like there's no more supply. And yet we do still have a lot of households forming. In the last decade, from 2013 to 2023, there were 17 million new households formed. Um, Explain that a little bit, Corey. What does it mean to form a household?
So household formation, you go from living with your parents, as a kid, that's one household, to you maybe moving off to college and med school. I guess that's kind of forming a new household with your college and med school roommates. And then, often, I guess maybe not necessarily for med students, by that point you might be settling down, but I guess yeah, you settle down with a partner. You were living with three roommates. Now you leave your roommates and go move in to get your own place because you want your own place. You're sick of sharing the sink and the dishwasher and the bathroom, or maybe you move in with your partner. That's a new household being formed. Four people living under one roof. It's one household. All four of them go out and get their own, separate homes, living, as individuals. That's, three new households being formed when previously four people were living under one roof. Now four people are living under four different roofs. So
Yeah.
household formation, when that's just the natural progression in life. You get married, have
You grow
kids.
up a
Not
little bit.
everyone, but most people, you don't want to have a
Are
spouse
you
and
with me?
children with roommates.
Got
Did I
it.
lose you?
Yep. A little bit, but it might have just been on my end. So
All right.
maybe everything got it up. Maybe we'll edit that out. But so back to the point from 2013 to 2023, 17 million new households were formed. And during that same time period, there were a total of 13 million new homes built, 9 million single family, 4 million multifamily. So in about 1.4 to 1.5 million new homes were built in 2023, which has been an increase over previous years, but it's still not enough. We need to build over 2 million new units per year to meet demand and close the gap that already exists because there's already this gap between homes that are available and people that want to own homes. So current costs are also really high to build new homes. Like inflation has cooled a bit, but interest rates are still fairly high. They're starting to come down, but still fairly high. And those higher interest rates make it harder for builders to be able to come up with capital to build these homes. On top of that, there's still a lot of labor challenges. Geographically, it might vary a little bit, but in a lot of places, it's still hard to hire people to build homes, like the boots on the ground that are doing the work. And if you have to pay them more, it costs you more to build the house. And there's just this big disconnect between how much is it costing, which is driving up the costs of new homes for people to buy as well. The builders have to be able to cover their costs, whether it's interest or labor or materials and all of that kind of stuff.
Or if there's just
So,
labor shortages, it's going to take
yeah,
longer to get a project done, which means you can't turn as many projects as
yep,
quickly. So you're going to have to charge more to ultimately make a profit each year. Um,
yeah.
Whereas you could, do more projects for a little less money. You got to do less projects for a little more money to still put food on the table if you're a builder.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I do think it's important to note that this is not just an American or United States problem. Like globally, housing prices are pretty high. Obviously, it depends on geography, like depends on where you're looking, but there's lots of problems in many major international cities where housing prices are very high as well and have gotten worse over the past decade and a half or so.
Yeah, America looks pretty good when you compare to some major international markets like, London, Tokyo, Toronto, Sydney, etc. It's like, wow, New York and San Francisco are relatively affordable by comparison. So when you look at like a income to housing cost ratio. So
Mhm.
so
Which is
that
probably
that's
one of the more important things to look at. Like sometimes we just look at the like overall cost, but that income to cost ratio is pretty important.
but seeing that it's more expensive elsewhere could be foretelling that it might even get worse here in America, if you take a pessimist approach to projecting the future, which
Yeah.
no one can predict the future. We've talked about this before. It's anyone's guess.
Yep. It's fun to guess sometimes. Okay. So, one other problem when we're thinking about building homes is red tape. So, there are many regulations and requirements needed to start housing projects, and they vary a lot from city to city. Like every city has their own regulations. First, you need to meet with the city planners and discuss the planned project. Then, you have to submit an application. That takes several months to prepare. You have to look at the zoning. What is the land currently zoned for? Is it residential? Is it commercial? Is it single family? Is it multifamily? What can we build here? Can we petition to have the zoning changed if we want to like build something else? You have to do some sort of environmental impact study. You need to complete like that and make sure that you're doing everything you need to do. You have to pay for all of that, to pay designers, engineers, architects, permit fees. That's a big thing. And applying for the permits, waiting for the permits, paying the fees, all of that process, legal fees, environmental studies. And then there can be public hearings, especially if you're looking to like build a multifamily unit inside of a neighborhood that has historically been single family. I've seen this in my area. There's a lot that's like maybe a few blocks from our house with this old house with a chain link fence around it that's been vacant for 2 years and looks like it's going to fall down tomorrow, if not yesterday. And yet, there's a sign on the fence that's like public hearing, going to be this August, except it's actually like last August. That's the date on the sign. And nothing's happened still because whoever owns that land is still working on that development, but they're planning to build 4 units there. And it has taken a very long time. They haven't even broken ground yet. There's no sign of any sort of equipment. So again, there's a very good anecdotal evidence that these things take a long time. Even if we're trying to do the things that will help long term, it's not like it happens overnight.
Yeah. I mean, just looking at my own neighborhood, we moved into one of the first homes here in 2023, summer of 2023. The development started back in 2015 with all like the plans, the permits into the city, etc. So it was basically an 8-year process from when they start the project to when they actually start making some money and selling the property. So I guess maybe 1 year less because they sold it to the builder the year prior and then it got built. But still, it's a long timeline. If you're going to develop a new project, and we didn't even talk about who's in charge of paying for like putting the sewer pipes in, running the telephone lines, the electricity and all that stuff. I mean, not all cities are going to want to foot the bill for that. Some of that's going to fall on the developer if they want to get that housing project done. You got to have water run into the homes. You got to have electricity. You got to have internet nowadays. So there's, the costs go on, and it can often be a long turnaround time before they can actually recoup those costs. And like you said a little bit ago, interest rates make it more challenging. And I wouldn't say interest rates are high. Like historically speaking, they're still pretty modest. That being said, everything is relative. When you're coming off of a zero interest rate environment where if you're a big entity and you can essentially borrow money for nothing from a bank, big companies could get under 1% interest rate loans from banks back in
Mm-hmm.
the last decade. Now that's not the case. It's costing 4, 5, 6% interest or more potentially to get loans, especially smaller companies. They don't have as much power, but if you previously could get a loan for 3% interest and now it's 7% interest, that's going to slow down your production because it's now more than twice as expensive to borrow money to finance your operations, and it just exacerbates the problems. And yeah, developers are for-profit entities. They're in the business of making money. So unless that changes, unless there's nonprofit, which there are, there's some nonprofit builders out there, but they're not building the homes for you, unfortunately. And there's, I guess the other solution, which we could talk about, would be, the government stepping in and subsidizing builders. Um, the builders need to turn a profit, and especially after the 2008 debacle, a lot of builders lost everything. They're taking a more conservative approach and making sure they're not going to be at risk of losing everything again.
Yep. I think there are also like a couple of other random things that have made this supply and demand issue a little more intense, but maybe these are focused on a little too much, honestly. But
Maybe
you
more the
hear,
attention than actual impact.
yeah, I
People with
mean, we can,
agendas talking about it.
I know, I think there's some agendas behind some of these things for sure. But, one thing that people sometimes blame is like foreign buyers and institutions buying property. So internet forums, Twitter, you say housing is expensive and they're like, oh, it's because people from XYZ country are coming in and buying up properties and just holding them and not doing anything with them. Okay, like maybe that happens once in a while, but this is not like a widespread problem. In reality, institutions only purchase about 3 to 5% of homes, and foreign buyers purchase maybe 2% of homes. So it's a pretty darn small percentage, probably not a big contributor to the issue. Although, every little thing matters when there's a big issue like this. So it's not that it doesn't matter at all, but it probably doesn't have nearly as big of an impact as just not building enough, period. The other thing that you sometimes see people bring up is like short term rentals, like Airbnbs and vacation homes. So if you're a person that owns two homes and you're not living in both of them full time, because how could you live in them both full time? That creates a little bit of a supply problem. And also, as people are buying up houses and then doing short term rentals, they're not full all the time. There's periodic vacancies. Hotels are not as full. Like in general, it used to be you stayed at a hotel when you were staying somewhere, right? Like that was the solution in these big multi-unit facilities that were very efficient. So I think this has a bigger impact in places like popular vacation towns. Like you can see like ski towns in Colorado where housing costs have exploded. And maybe that is partially because of things like Airbnb. But there's several studies that have shown that this explains across the board probably less than 1% of housing costs. So maybe it has an impact in very specific areas, but generally that's not a huge part of the problem.
I would probably throw in we didn't have it on here, but remote work I think has made the challenge in those smaller communities. Like before, the ski town was only the vacation destination. Maybe a few people lived there full time, but not really. Now with it's harder for doctors, but for like Rachelle and I, like we could, as long as we have internet access, we can work from anywhere. And you saw a lot of that in places like the Colorado towns, Ketchum, Idaho, outside of Sun Valley, where I live here in Central Oregon. Like housing prices shot up because a lot of people can move and live there and work remotely from those locations. Now that potentially could shift. You've seen news headlines recently. Amazon's mandating employees be in the office 5 days a week. I'm sure other companies might do something similar. How impactful that will be on our entire economy and where people live to be determined. But I don't think remote work is going away. If
Mm-mm.
anything, it's only probably going to be a more present thing, especially as technology allows more people to do jobs remotely. I mean, you're even seeing it in medicine, especially for certain specialties like radiology. You can, I mean, not with interventional, but with diagnostic, you could literally be anywhere in the world and do your job as long as you have an internet connection. Um, so you're starting in some primary care docs. I just had an email from a client recently saying they accepted a position that's fully remote and they're basically going to see people over Zoom meetings.
Mm-hmm.
Um, like I think we've all probably had urgent care visits where it's just a video conference and they're like, yep, I'll prescribe you some whatever Advil. That's not a prescription, but solves the problem.
Take some ibuprofen.
Yeah,
Done.
you're good. Walk it off.
Good thing Corey and I aren't doctors.
Yeah. Cheaper than going to the ER
Okay.
to tell them to go home and take Advil.
Yeah, absolutely.
But let's see, where
Yeah.
were you? We talked about short-term.
Demographics. Yeah. I think demographics also affects this, particularly in the United States. In many countries, old people tend to move in with their adult children, three generations living under one roof. So, like that household that maybe was two households now becomes one household, which can be helpful for housing. In America, that's just not the case generally. Like, obviously, that still happens sometimes, but it's less frequent than it is in a lot of other places. And older people tend to hold on to their homes as long as they can. And then when they do, they potentially go into like a care facility. And even after that, if that house now becomes the kids, they don't necessarily sell it right away. They might keep it for nostalgia purposes. Corey has a story about this one that's particularly, I
Yeah.
think, extreme, but
I mean, yeah, my Lindsay's one of her aunt and uncles lived across the street from her grandma, their parents, and her grandma passed away like 9 years ago, and they still own grandma's home vacant, sitting across the street. I think ultimately the plan was to one day move in, and then their kids would take their house, kind of a whole, it's kind of move up the housing. I don't know if it's a ladder, but we take grandma's
yeah,
house, kids take our house, their kids take their house type of ordeal. But yeah, no, grandma's house just been sitting there very vacant and obviously not contributing to the housing um, supply for people because it's a vacant home. But it's actually somewhat fortuitous because unfortunately their home they had a fire in the attic this week and it like the roof collapsed into their living room, so they are temporarily moving across the street into grandma's house while their home gets hopefully rebuilt. It's going to be a process with insurance and everything. But yeah, I mean, I think that while probably not super common, it it's not super uncommon either. Kids inherit grandma's house or their parents' house, I suppose, and don't know what to do with it, don't have the time to deal with it, the emotional capacity to deal with it. If they're not strained financially to where they need to sell that home to make ends meet for themselves, they could take a few years potentially before they clear it out, eventually get it listed, or maybe they do decide to keep it for emotional reasons. But it's uh, I think yeah, basically, until people literally start dying off and vacating their homes, as brutal as that sounds, there's some truth to it. There's going to be, at least for existing homes, a bit of a shortage in the supply unless we start building more to fill that gap.
Right. So, I mean, that's where we come to possible solutions. And obviously, like the easiest thing is to build more houses, but it's not easy. Like we talked about all the reasons that it is not easy. So, one of the more practical solutions is just to build more multifamily units because if we have to go through this process, we might as well get the most bang for our buck in our work and have several units instead of just one unit. And that does require some social change and some acceptance and desire of people to live in more urban and multifamily settings. I think in New York City is a really good example where that's just the way it is. People live close to other people, like population is very dense. I think we have seen some moves towards doing that in places like Minneapolis, places like Portland, but it needs to happen more and more places. And it's also, not necessarily easy to do it even in those places where it's allowed.
And it's
So I think,
also a supply and demand issue. Like, if unless people are willing to live in a multifamily unit, a builder is not incentivized to build a multifamily unit because they're not going to be able to sell those units. Now, granted, most multifamily housing developments are rentals. They're building apartments for rent, not to own. So it can help somewhat, particularly for younger individuals who are more prone to renting than owning. But yeah, until there's a social mindset shift of being willing to live in a multifamily place as like that's the norm for your life, I think it might be challenging. It could maybe put help with younger folks in housing, but and whether that's like the starter home that's a step up to the next home, I guess could be a beneficial thing, but it will take some social change before that becomes a more widespread. That's just my opinion. I don't know.
mhm. Yeah, I think it's much more common right now to just see multiple smaller houses built on larger lots that previously had one home. So when I can think of the examples in my neighborhood, it's not necessarily multifamily housing, but it's still more dense housing. So it's, a
They
lot that had
divide the
one
lot in
house,
two, yeah,
yeah, or four, like
and then
the,
build skinny
yeah,
tall houses.
right. So the lot that I'm thinking about that's been vacant for like 2 years that has one house on it, and I think they're planning to build four units, but I'm pretty sure they're going to be single family homes. I don't think they're going to be attached dwelling units. So lots of different ways to approach this, but obviously density can be really helpful. There are also some moves towards making it easier for builders to build homes by removing some red tape. I think that it's hard to kind of back down on regulations once they're there. So it's something that has not been necessarily easy to untangle, and or city councils have not necessarily been super willing to do that. But I was reading a couple more articles about Portland specifically, and there have been some moves towards doing that. It's just like, what do we make easier? Like, what's important here? Like, is it important that we do the environmental impact study, but not that important that we get public comment? Like, where do we cut corners? And that I think can be the hard thing to decide.
Yeah, pros and cons to everything. If you make one change over here, how is that going to impact other things for better or worse? Probably a little bit of both. But
Yeah.
let's see, mentality change from the NIMBY, not in my backyard, to the YIMBY, yes in my backyard, which are the funny acronyms there. And maybe in some areas you're starting to see it, but it probably needs to be broader scale if we're going to start developing more multifamily units. In single family neighborhoods. But all you need to get to is that tipping point. If you read that Malcolm Gladwell book, which he just came out, well, by the time you listen to it, it'll be about a month ago. But yesterday, the Revenge of the Tipping Point. It's basically Tipping Point version 2. He wrote,
2.0.
yeah, 2.0, that I just started reading. But yeah, it just requires a little bit of a social tidal wave, if you will, and then before you know it, that's the norm. So you
Yeah.
never know.
I remember reading another article in the New York Times that was talking about like you have these very like coastally progressive reputations. Like California is progressive, Oregon is progressive, Washington is progressive. And yet you have these systems that have created these really high housing costs basically ingrained in government, ingrained in like how we're doing zoning and all of these kinds of things. And it's like you can't claim to be like a person who wants to make things more affordable for people and not allow it to happen because of like how the system is set up. So it just, I think you're so right that it needs to be just an attitude and societal change more than anything else.
And I totally get it, to play
Mm-hmm.
devil's advocate. Like, do I want a 30-story apartment complex going in next door to me? No, I don't.
Neither
Um,
do I.
None of you do. Like, but there's got to be a somewhere where it can be met in the middle, to where maybe not like just have random apartment complexes being built in residential neighborhoods, but you take maybe an older neighborhood, it may be a city. Like, I mean, Detroit might be a perfect example of a city that's made a turnaround. I haven't been there in recent years, but apparently downtown Detroit now is awesome. It's clean, it's vibrant. They've got arts, they got restaurants, they got, all the sporting complexes there, and it was, Detroit was like the punchline of a lot of jokes of cities that, used to be vibrant and are no longer, but they've made a comeback. And you could start to see that maybe in some areas and communities that are somewhat depressed, get some investment in there, tear all the old dilapidated housing down, build, a planned community with multifamily housing, retail, restaurants, etc. Um, but but yeah, I mean it can happen. It just, it's going to take a little bit of effort. And it doesn't have to, you can have both, I guess is what I'm saying. It doesn't have
Mm-hmm.
to, you know, they don't have to butt heads necessarily.
Yeah. I think one
Um,
other solution could potentially be to offer government subsidies to developers, just like we do for farming. We incentivize farms to keep growing things so that our food supply is secure.
and
Maybe we do something.
inexpensive.
Yeah, exactly. And then maybe we do something similar for housing. And yeah, I think that was obviously be very complicated. Do that at the state level? Do we do that at the federal level? Do cities do that? Like, who knows what that even looks like? But it could potentially be something that gets explored in the future, especially if this problem does not start to resolve itself a little bit.
For sure.
Yeah.
Like everything, there's trade-offs. How are we going to provide government subsidies? It's going to come from tax dollars. So,
Hmm.
do we need to raise taxes to generate that revenue, or do we need to cut funding to other areas to generate that revenue? Don't want to get into a political discussion here, and everyone has different opinions on how it can happen, but that's a potential solution. But it's going to come at a cost of something else not getting government funding. But yeah, I mean, we do it with farming. Like, there's zero reason under any normal circumstance that a head of lettuce should cost 79 cents. Like, a farmer will not profit from selling lettuce for under $1 a head. But because we subsidize most of the costs associated with farming in this country, the farmers can still make some money and get by and, keep food affordable. Like, food costs have decreased on an inflation adjusted basis and relative to income over time. People don't quote me to these numbers, but you can Google it. I mean, back in like the 50s, people would spend like, I think, over 20% of their income on food. Now it's under 10% of their income is spent on food. So, we've got food at a reasonable cost for us. Can we do something similar for housing? I don't know.
Hmm. Yep. I do think demographic changes could potentially help longer term, but this will take a while. We have an aging population. Boomers own the majority of homes right now, baby boomers, that generation. And their population is expected to start declining more rapidly in the 2030s as people kind of reach life expectancy. Kind of sad to think about. But, if existing homeowners start passing away and their descendants do not just hold on to vacant properties, and those homes actually get sold or someone moves into them, like that can be helpful. In the United States, like population is projected to peak in 2080, which is so long from now. Like that is, I mean, I can't even imagine 2080. Like Colette will probably be around. I probably won't.
I don't know. It's 55 years from now. It's
Yeah,
coin
probably
flip.
not.
You might
I
be.
mean, probably not. I'm
Keep
I'm old,
keep
but
eating your homegrown vegetables and fruits and
yeah, no pesticides here. Woo.
exercise, do yoga. Yeah, you might be
Ooh,
around at a
probably work on that.
in around the age of 100.
Yeah. Anyway, the birth rate clearly points to population declining. That's kind of buoyed a little bit by immigration right now. So, depending on how immigration policy changes over time, like those projections could be influenced. But demographics are changing. Like that is absolutely happening. And we've seen it happen in European countries and things like that as well. So,
So,
yeah.
what should you do? Because that's really what you care about most. How does this impact me? How can I benefit or how can I find ways to help my situation? Um, I guess be patient is one option. Easier said than
Hopefully
done.
not until 2080,
Yeah, maybe not that long, but don't feel pressured to go buy a house at all because your parents or siblings or someone told you, "Oh, you're a grown up now. You need to buy a house."
Why are you wasting so much money on rent?
Yeah, if
Yeah.
to each their own, everyone's circumstances is different. If you're happy, content with renting and renting works for you, great. If you currently own a home and the home works for you, I mean, Rochelle and I are talking purely from a financial perspective. Like, don't feel pressured to upgrade just to keep up with the Joneses or live the stereotypical doctor lifestyle. If your home works and you're happy in it, great. If your home maybe feels a little cramped, we had another kid, it would be nice to have a little more room, but the cost to buy a new home that would be ideal for us, it would be double what our current home costs. Maybe we look into, some renovations, adding a wing, or a bedroom, if that's possible with the footprint of your home on your lot. There are some creative ways where you could stay in your existing home and in a more cost-effective manner make it more livable for your circumstances than trying to buy a new home. But again, case by case basis on all of those.
Yeah. Do your best not to make yourself house poor. It's such a hard thing to avoid right now. But if you can avoid spending more than 20% of your gross income before taxes on housing, that can be really helpful to make sure you have wiggle room in the budget to do other things. And I think sometimes that means lowering your expectations. Like, what is it that I want or need to be able to be happy in a home? Like, let's look at this and really see what it takes. And part of that might be like I need financial security. Like that could be part of the criteria that you're using when you look at what house you're buying. Like if you have more financial security because you spent less on a house and aren't stretched super thin, you will be happier. So just make sure that you don't necessarily have to think of it as a sacrifice when you're maybe not getting exactly as big of a house as you want, if you know that you're going to be more comfortable because you bought a slightly smaller home and things like that.
Yeah, I mean, Rochelle and I can speak from experience. Everyone who buys a house has some regrets about that house, whether it be something small, like, oh, I wish, we had this room over here or that, or I wish we had a pantry that was bigger, or whatever it is. I wish the laundry room was upstairs instead of downstairs, or vice versa. Well, I think the biggest regret of people, and this has been shown in polls, is spending too much on a house. They wanted to stretch the budget to get the home that they liked, and it just made the rest of their finances and their life more stressful. Now, we've talked before, like if you're early in your career, permission slip to maybe stretch a little bit because it's likely that your income is going to rise over time. But we don't want to stretch too much if it's unlikely that we're going to be able to, get up to that point where we're spending less than 20% of our income on housing. And I mean, it's just a math equation. We've done the math enough times for most people, and not everyone case by case, but for most people, if you can keep your housing costs below 20% of your income. So for simple math, if you make 300,000 a year, you can spend 60,000 on housing or less. 5,000 a month is your housing costs, whether that's renting or your mortgage plus property taxes, et cetera. Keep it under 5,000 a month. We found that ratio still enables you to pay down your student loans, take vacations, save for retirement, maybe throw a little bit of money in the kid's college account. Might be still feel a little tight while you have your student loans, but those should be paid off within a handful of years. of entering practice. And then it starts to become a little more flexible. But if you spend more than 20% of your income on housing, it's just you're not going to be able to accomplish all the other things that you want to do, and you're going to have to make some tough financial decisions, which, can create some additional stresses in your life that you don't want or need.
Yep. Another way we can potentially do this if we don't want to spend less on a house is maybe make more money. So, and that can be really doable depending on where you're at in life and what your profession is and how much you're working and things like that. So, keep an open mind about those kinds of things. It can definitely help a lot. One other thing just to point out is like a bank will lend you much more than what would be the equivalent of 20% of your income. They would probably lend you double that if you didn't have any other debt.
Yeah, banks
So,
will let you spend like 40% of your income on debt.
yes, exactly. So, just because the bank says you're approved for up to this dollar amount doesn't mean that's like your goal or how much you should be spending. So just keep that in mind when you're house shopping if you're looking at houses. But I mean, going back to client conversations, we have lots of conversations with clients. Sometimes I feel like people feel like they're doing something wrong because they can't afford the house that they want. It's very much like, what am I doing wrong? And maybe it's nothing. Like if you live in a place that's quite expensive, even if you're making a very good income and doing everything else right, it might just be that it's not very affordable where you live. So give yourself a break, take time, make sure that whatever you do decide to do, it makes sense for you financially and isn't just because it's the thing to do. And if you end up renting for a while, that is not necessarily the end of the world.
Definitely not. I mean, in some markets in America, the math pencils out to where it's a way more favorable to rent forever
Yeah.
than it is to buy. In other markets, it makes more sense to buy. Removing the emotional reasons for buying a house from the equation, just the pure spreadsheet analysis. So that's where we say it's case by case. But I mean, the make more income thing, that's, some people laugh, oh, yeah, how silly, make more income, huh? But like, it's more realistic than a lot of people think. Negotiate for pay raises when your contract's up for review. Talk to your peers about how much they're making, and you can get an idea of if you're being paid fairly, or if you should be in a position to ask for a pay raise. Interview for other jobs. Consider moving to other cities that potentially could pay you more. In medicine, you're in a unique spot in that if you go move to we'll call it the flyover states for lack of a better term, it's going to be less expensive for housing than the coastal states, and you're going to get paid more. Geographic arbitrage. You make more money in less expensive cost of living areas just because the demand for doctors is greater there. There's not as much supply. Pediatricians are a dime a dozen in New York and California. They're
Rude.
not a dime a dozen in Iowa or, Nebraska, or North Dakota. So,
Mm-hmm.
and you don't have to go live out in the sticks necessarily, but go to maybe a little bit smaller major city than a major city. Pros and cons, but food for thought. Um,
For sure.
so anything else you can think of?
I don't think so. I think if you have questions, you know where to find us.
Absolutely. Have a good one. We'll see you next time.